Motion. The movement of an object from one place to another. It can be described by its speed, direction, and acceleration. In the world of video games, motion plays a crucial role in creating realistic and immersive experiences, but it can also be used to exaggerate those things as well. For example, in sports games like FIFA, the motion of the players and the ball are often based on real-life physics to create a more authentic experience. But in something like arcade racing games, things like motion blur, speed lines, or other effects are often embellished to make the cars feel faster than they would be in real life. But one thing that both games have in common is how important character movement or object movement is. The only physical thing connecting a player to the game is the controller, so the input of a player's device must feel smooth and match up with what is happening on screen. Even the way those characters react to their environment or other players must be executed carefully in order to give that sense of immersion. It's hard to get lost in a game that doesn't make you feel like you're there. This implementation of motion is especially crucial when it comes to fighting games, as even the tiniest of movements can have a significant impact on the game. So today, we're going to look at the importance of motion in fighting games and how it's the key to making them great. If you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe. It helps the channel out and you can always change your mind. Now when I talk about motion in fighting games, I'm referring to everything the characters do on screen. This includes attacks, movement like running and jumping, and even things like blocking. There are some cases where the movement of stages or other factors come into play, but for simplicity, I'm going to stick with just the characters as that is something that every fighting game has. From a visual perspective, motion is obviously important for making the game look good. A character with smooth and fluid movements can create a more dynamic and exciting experience for the player, while a character with choppy and sluggish movements can worsen the overall experience. Part of the reason why Street Fighter 3rd Strike is so popular and is still being talked about today is because of its incredible animation. The character designs are all incredibly detailed, with each fighter having their own unique style and moveset. The in-game animation also flows really well, making the fights look and feel like real martial arts matches. The way they did it was using a combination of traditional hand-drawn animation and computer-generated graphics. The game's character sprites were mostly hand-drawn and then transferred digitally, allowing for a lot more control and detail at the cost of time and probably sanity. However, this wasn't the case for some characters like Elena. You can tell something looks different about her from the rest of the cast, and that's because some of her moves are rotoscope. Someone was actually able to find the source material for her victory pose, which kind of led to people looking further into it, and it is believed that the same method was used for her idle animation as well. You can even see the sprite change for a split second in Street Fighter New Generation when her heel animation is active. An advantage that rotoscoping gives is the smoothest in animation and less time spent because every sprite is basically drawn for you. You just have to trace it. But just like everything else, it also comes with a cost. You can clearly see the loss in detail when looking at the hands and feet compared to other characters that were fully drawn. It's kind of like what happens when people use that TikTok filter. Also, once you realize this, it's very obvious that her head was just pasted on afterwards, as it never moves, which is kind of uncanny. In the grand scheme of things, it's not really a big deal, as the game moves so fast anyway, so you probably wouldn't notice. It's just something once you notice, you really can't unsee. But the technique of how artists choose to animate motion plays a big role in the overall art style and feel of the game. For example, Mortal Kombat uses motion capture to realistically showcase moves accurately. It's basically like how Elena was rotoscoped, but for 3D. This technique makes the game feel and look modern, as you're essentially using real-life moves and attacks for the base of your characters, then changing or tweaking certain parts whenever needed. It also makes the animation process slightly easier, in terms of getting the core movement down at least, as most of your time will be spent tweaking the animation instead of creating it. It's been clear since the beginning that Mortal Kombat has always gone for a more realistic approach in how their characters move. The first iteration of the game used real people as sprites, and then imported them straight into the game, so it's only fitting that they'd use motion capture to retain that same essence. Tekken also has adopted this technique as well, and in my opinion it gets to showcase it better because the game's movement allows players to use every aspect of the 3D space. If you've ever seen tasks used on Tekken characters, the way they dodge each other's attacks feels like you're watching a martial arts movie where both opponents are at similar skill levels. Now, something that this style of animation lacks in my opinion is elasticity. It's not a bad thing if you're going for a more modern approach like Tekken or Mortal Kombat, but it's definitely something you have to consider when choosing a style of animation. Elasticity is what gives cartoons its dramatic feel. When a Looney Tunes character gets bonked in the head, the extreme movements and reactions of that character effectively showcase that. The compressing and stretching of limbs really sells how hard that frying pan hit Tom's face, even though that kind of body distortion isn't realistic. You can see this technique in a lot of 2D animated games like Skullgirls. The wind-up and release of attacks have this effect to show how powerful the move is. The more your character basically breaks its limbs, the more damage that move does. Although there are a few exceptions like Dhalsim, whose whole moveset is based on him being stretchy. This technique is often paired with something called smearing. While elasticity can show the wind-up and release of an attack, smearing displays the speed of it, as it is often used between frames of key poses. There are usually two different ways of smearing an animation. The first way is to quite literally smear the in-between frames, distorting them and stretching them as they move from one to another. The second way is by sort of duplicating the frames, with all of them kind of overlapping each other until the animation is finished. Both methods are effective and is sometimes used together, as there really isn't a correct way to do it. It will always look smooth as long as you can create some sort of motion blur between the frames, because that's all you're basically doing. One of the challenges in implementing motion in fighting games is achieving balance between realism and creativity. Super realistic fighting games require accurate simulations of movement. This introduces the element of randomness, where some reactions to moves don't always have the same result, just like in real life. For example, in UFC you might be able to get a knockdown a certain way, but if that situation happens again, there's a chance that you won't. This is why in the UFC game you don't have a health bar, as there's no fixed amount of damage that moves have. On the other hand, overly creative and flashy moves can make it really hard to balance the game, especially when those attacks have a lot of forward movement. I mean, look no further than Luke. I've talked about him enough, so you guys already know. And when you start to drift really far from the realm of martial arts, at what point does a game stop being a fighting game and turn into something else like a shooter, for example? This is the reason why many fighting games share similar mechanics, especially when it comes to martial arts, because it's how the genre roots itself. But don't get me wrong, it's good to think outside of the box, but at least make sure you visit it once in a while. Something I never realized before is how important it is for each move to communicate info to the players. Every single move should have these three things: startup frames, active frames, and recovery frames. Now, depending on what type of move it is, these three parameters are tweaked accordingly. Light attacks should usually be very quick, with minimal amounts of startup, active, and recovery frames, while special moves are usually slower, heavily telegraphed attacks that have a large portion of all three. And you can probably recognize why it's a bad idea to give normal moves long startup and recovery frames, or give special moves no startup or recovery. Another interesting thing to look at is how characters react to their attack missing or being blocked. Usually when this happens, the animation looks different and a different audio cue is played. This lets the opponent know that the other player has made an error, and they can punish accordingly. Overall, motion plays a significant role in fighting games as it affects the gameplay, strategy, and the smoothness of the game. So it's important for the devs to consider the pros and cons of the ways they choose to implement it, whether that's by 2D sprite animation, 3D motion capture, or even computer simulations. Each method has their own ways of adding excitement to the game. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, join the Discord to hang out with us, follow my Twitter for updates, check out my Twitch for streams, and if you want to get access to extra perks and content, you can head over to my Patreon. As always, I hope you guys have a great day. Peace.